In the heat of battle, amid shouts and steel, the foundations of one of the most powerful empires in history were forged. Rome, eternal and grand, built its glory on the shoulders of thousands of ordinary men, soldiers who wielded the gladius, who bled on the orders of generals who would be immortalized in marble, while they themselves were buried in oblivion. But what happened to those who survived? What fate awaited the broken bodies and souls shattered by war? This is the story of those men, not of the emperors or the triumphs carved in stone, but of the nameless faces who returned home with invisible scars. Men who fought in distant lands and, upon returning, faced an even crueler battle, the indifference of their own empire. Join us through the shadows of Rome, where the real war began, just as the fighting ended. On the bloodied fields of the empire, there was no silence, no peace. Only the thunder of hooves hitting the earth, metal breaking bone, and the screams of men who, until that moment, had never known fear. Rome did not fight with arrows or at long range. It fought face to face, with the enemy's breath brushing its face, its gaze fixed on death. The gladius, a short, murderous blade, was the echo of an unforgiving civilization. With each thrust, Rome claimed territory. And Roman warfare wasn't elegant. It wasn't a choreography of perfect discipline, as sculptors often portrayed it. It was a merciless chaos, a bloodbath in mud, sweat, and excrement. The legionary wasn't a hero in shining armor. He was a filthy, exhausted body, soaked in his own blood or that of his comrade. Glory was stained with mud, triumph with desperate cries, and yet thousands marched for her, for Rome, for a name on a tombstone, for a promised plot of land, for the hope of being something more than a peasant without a history. Trained to kill, hardened to not feel, Roman soldiers crossed borders with only one certainty: only 1 in 10 would return. But the real horror wasn't dying. It was living with what you saw. It was continuing to breathe after slicing open another human being. It was looking into the eyes of a dying enemy and seeing your own brother. In war, the soul breaks long before the bones, and yet no one spoke of it. The Senate didn't write speeches about night terrors or the trembling hands that wouldn't let go of their swords even in sleep. History recounted the victories, but it never told how much they cost. Because the price wasn't just in blood, it was in humanity. Weapons could be drawn and put away, but internal wounds had no scabbard. And when the soldier hung up his mail, what remained was not a citizen. It was a specter, one who had seen hell and returned to walk among the living, no longer belonging to the world. But this was just the beginning. Amidst the devastation, the body could withstand more than the mind believed. Spears tore through flesh and bone, pylons tore through legs, and curved shafts left wounds impossible to extract. It was not uncommon to see dangling limbs, empty eyes, and exposed ribs. In Celsus's medical accounts, exposed viscera are described as if it were routine mechanics. There was no mercy in those lines, only clinical observation, but not all the wounded died, and that, sometimes, was worse. Because surviving meant crawling through the mud among corpses, hoping to be picked up by makeshift stretcher bearers, or, worse, being ignored. If you weren't fit to fight, you weren't worth the effort. That was the logic of the empire. Everything had to move forward, even if that meant leaving the broken behind. Those who were rescued fared no better. Roman medicine was functional, but brutal. The Valetudinarium, a military hospital, was not a place of rest. It was a torture chamber with practical intentions. There, pain was the diagnosis. The hot iron was the solution. Amputation was the happy ending. The soldier struggled between infection and the blade, between gangrene and the sewing of new scars. The doctors, though wise for their time, didn't have the luxury of time or modern knowledge. They used wine, vinegar, and herbs. When those failed, they turned to fire. And when fire failed, death remained. The screams weren't hidden. They could be heard throughout the camp, between tents, warehouses, and dormitories. No one slept peacefully near the hospital, because there was nothing more terrifying than hearing a comrade in arms beg to be allowed to die, because they knew that perhaps tomorrow would be their turn. Surviving the wound was a lottery, but even those who won did so at too high a price. Losing a leg, an arm, half a face, also meant losing the right to a normal life, to a wife, to a piece of land, to an identity. They were soldiers, yes, but what were they afterward? And this barely scratched the surface. Some returned home with no visible scars, no limps or bandages, and yet they were more wounded than anyone. Because inside their heads, the war was still alive. They slept with their eyes open. They sweated in the cold nights. They reacted violently to the slightest noise. They had left the battlefield, but the battlefield hadn't left them. No one in Rome knew what to call it. Today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. They had no words, only suspicions. They said those men were weak, that they lacked discipline, that a true Roman endured pain without crying. That war built character, not broke it. Thus, thousands suffered in silence. They walked among the crowd, their eyes lost. They avoided parties, rejected human contact, and didn't talk about what they had experienced, because they knew no one would understand them, because they knew that to remember was to relive, and relive hurt too much. The trauma hid in the simplest gestures, in the way they always sat with their backs to the wall, in the way they never fully let go of their swords, in the way they trembled at a crash of thunder or the cry of a child. They were soldiers, but they were also victims. And Rome didn't know what to do with victims. Some returned to the army, not for glory or loyalty, but because they knew nothing else, because only there did they find meaning. Others simply got lost. They wandered through distant provinces, aimless, without family, without purpose. They died young. They died alone. The empire that had molded them into war machines had no room for them as humans, because Rome understood conquest, but not compassion. The broken were silenced. They were buried, literally or symbolically. They were remembered only as another statistic, but history cannot ignore them forever. The true invisible heroes of the legions didn't always wield swords. Some carried forceps, saws, and ointments. They were the Medici, Rome's military doctors. But their job wasn't to save lives in the noble sense we imagine today. Their mission was to keep the soldier functional long enough to return to the front. In their world, healing was a military strategy, not an act of humanity. Every stable Roman camp had a valetudinarium, a hospital divided into sections: fever, open wounds, recovery. There, the Medici worked under pressure, surrounded by pain, with no time for hesitation. They used wine as a disinfectant, vinegar as a cleanser, and herbs like mandrake and willow bark to soothe the suffering. But when the gods wouldn't listen, hot iron took over. Cauterization wasn't a procedure, it was a sentence. A red-hot rod was applied directly to the bleeding flesh. The smell was nauseating. The skin hissed like meat on a slow fire. The scream of the wounded echoed throughout the camp, and more than one person preferred to faint rather than face that bonfire. But even so, it was better than bleeding to death in a ditch. Amputations were another common recourse. If the wound began to fester, there was no discussion. It was cut. With luck, the soldier had drunk enough wine to not feel the first cut. Bronze saws were unforgiving, and speed was essential, not out of mercy, but because infection could devour the body from within. Every minute counted, and yet the Medici were respected and feared in equal measure. They weren't mere healers. They were the judges of the battlefield. They decided who lived, who lost an arm, and who wouldn't see the dawn. Their knowledge was limited, but their mettle was unwavering. Where others saw mangled flesh, they saw possibilities of survival. Despite everything, many soldiers preferred to crawl out of the hospital rather than enter one. They knew that if they passed through those doors, their lives were no longer their own. They were passing into the hands of men who, even if they did their best, worked with primitive tools in hellish conditions. Surviving a valetudinarium was almost as difficult as surviving a German ambush. But the hardest journey of all was yet to come. A battle could end in hours, but the suffering of the wounded lasted for days, weeks, years. For many, the true hell began when they were dragged from the battlefield. If they didn't die right there, they had to endure an inhuman journey to some point of safety. Sometimes that place was days away. The stretchers were improvised from spears and blood-stained capes. The carts, without suspension, squealed over stone and mud roads, tossing the wounded like rag dolls. Every pothole was a sting. Every meter traveled, an ordeal. Some screamed until they lost consciousness. Others simply stopped fighting. They died in silence, amidst the swaying and dust. Rome's priority was to keep the legion moving. There was no time to stop for the fallen. Logistics were efficient, but lacking in compassion. No one even considered that a soldier might be dying in the back of a cart. It was part of the price, just another coin in the economy of war. In times of stability, permanent camps offered a measure of hope. There, the valetudinaria were rudimentary but organized structures, with drains, wooden beds, and separate spaces for each ailment. But even in these sanctuaries, infection lurked. Hygiene conditions were minimal. Knowledge about bacteria was non-existent. The result was a war against one's own body, against gangrene, fever, decomposition. And this war, silent and without applause, claimed more victims than the enemy's sword. Many survived the fight only to be devoured by an infected sore or a poorly healed wound. The doctors did what they could. They applied compresses of garlic, elderberry, and rue, as suggested by texts by Dioscorides. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they merely postponed the inevitable. It was a constant tug-of-war with death, which rarely lost. Galen made it clear, when there was no other option, the only way out was complete amputation. And while that saved lives, it left bodies incomplete and fates uncertain. When the physical pain subsided, a more subtle struggle began. What to do with a body no longer fit for war? Rome was a pragmatic empire. It had no patience for sentimentality. If a man couldn't wield a sword, he had to earn his place some other way, or be sidelined. Veterans who managed to complete 20 or 25 years of service received the Missio Honesta, an honorable discharge that granted them land, a pension, and even Roman citizenship if they didn't have it. It was a promise fulfilled. Glory after bloodshed. But very few reached that point. The seriously wounded, on the other hand, were discharged early under the Missio Causaria, a symbolically honorable medical discharge, but without real guarantees. They returned home without pay, without land, without visible honor. And that, in a culture where prestige was everything, was a second sentence. Sometimes there was no home to return to. The war had swept through their villages, or their families had disappeared, or they simply didn't fit in anymore. They didn't know how to talk to their children. They didn't know how to sleep without a sword under their pillow. They didn't know what to do with the peace, because for them, silence was suspicious. Some managed to reintegrate. They opened workshops, small taverns, and became modest merchants. But those were the minority. The majority remained floating on the periphery of society, uncomfortably remembered, quickly ignored, because no one liked to see the price of conquests up close. And yet, the army wasn't completely blind. In the times of emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, many veterans were reassigned to administrative roles. Scribes, instructors, warders. It was a way to retrain the wounded, to make their experience useful, but it wasn't a guarantee. Because in the dark days of the Empire, everything depended on chance. Not all wounded soldiers were forgotten. Some, though maimed, retained enough function to be reassigned. Rome, in its relentless practicality, knew that even a damaged body could be useful if it could still write, guard, or teach. Many were integrated as scribi, responsible for military bureaucracy, records, inventories, reports. Others became instructors, passing on their combat experience to new recruits. Although they could no longer fight, their words were sharp daggers, and their knowledge pure gold for training the next generation of legionaries. There were also those who moved on to guard duties, protecting warehouses, towers, or walls where brute force was less necessary. These second lives were, for many, a lifeline. Not just financially, but emotionally. A way to continue feeling part of something, to avoid falling into the void of irrelevance. But the system wasn't perfect. In times of crisis, protracted wars, or political collapse, such opportunities were scarce. And when there was no room, they fell into the abyss. But if there was anything worse than returning wounded, it was returning in dishonor. The missio ignominiosa was the cruelest form of dismissal from the Roman army. It was reserved for those accused of cowardice, insubordination, or undignified behavior. It wasn't a simple discharge. It was an eternal stain, a moral judgment that erased the man from the records. Losing that last chance at recognition meant losing everything. No pension, no land, no name. The ex-soldier branded with ignominy was an outcast, a shadow. In a society that idolized virtues, honor, and courage, to fall outside that framework was to be expelled from the human community. Some documents found in provinces like Britannia mention wounded men who were still punished with ignominy. Suffering and devotion didn't matter. A mistake, a suspicion, was enough to condemn them. And once condemned, they were left alone, untouched by the world. And what's coming is even darker. Being ignored by history hurts as much as a wound. In cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Carthage, it was common to find former soldiers begging for alms. Men who once marched with the world's most powerful legions, now reduced to spectral figures on street corners with visible scars and blank stares. Some had been forgotten by the state, others by their own families. They carried the trophies of war on their bodies, but no one wanted to see them because they reminded them of the uncomfortable side of the empire, the one that didn't appear in Senate speeches or in the reliefs of triumphal arches. Many weren't even recognized as veterans. They had been discharged silently, without papers, without ceremony. They traveled between provinces like identityless nomads, living off charity, the compassion of a few, or the survival instinct that still burned in their veins. Some tried to open small businesses with what little they had left, a tavern, a workshop, a traveling cart. But most had neither resources nor networks. Their only possession was their past, and that didn't fill their stomachs. Civilian life was alien to them. They were treated as if they had never belonged to that world. The pain wasn't just in their wounds, but in their gaze, in the way they stared at the temples they had once sworn to serve, in the way they avoided the parades where others, more fortunate, were honored, in the way they passed unseen among citizens who walked proudly beneath statues of emperors who had never known war. And in that oblivion, many decided to take paths that defied legality or morality, not out of malice, but out of hunger, out of desperation, because they had no other option, because Rome had used them and then discarded them. But there were still more dangerous paths to come. Necessity obliges, and in the Roman Empire, where violence was a spectacle, some veterans found the arena their only means of survival. Men who had killed for their country now killed for bread. They entered gladiator schools, transforming their military experience into bloody entertainment. It was a desperate decision, but also a logical one. There, at least, they could take advantage of what they knew how to do: fight, not for a cause, but for the applause of the people, for the promise of fame, gold, or simply a hot meal. Some, like the legendary Spiculus, achieved notoriety. Others died in the second battle. The arena was brutal, but it offered something the street didn't: visibility. In the amphitheaters, the veteran could become someone again, at least for a moment, at least in the eyes of a bloodthirsty crowd. It was a twisted form of redemption, of turning scars into currency. Not everyone made it to the Colosseums. Some became mercenaries, selling their expertise to trade caravans, senators, or provincial lords. They went where the money called. Which side no longer mattered. Only pay, only survival. Loyalty had been a luxury of their youth. Still others were lost in the shadows, linked to crime, local gangs, and urban mafias. Not because they wanted to, but because the system offered no other way. When glory fades and hunger strikes, morality becomes a privilege. And many of these men had already lost everything. Thus, Rome became a monster that devoured its own children. It turned them into legend, or left them to die amidst the stands and cheers, amidst dust and viscera, amidst steel and despair. And yet, there were those who resisted. For the veterans who found neither honor nor redemption, one last battle remained: to survive in indifference. They did so silently, without glory, in the corners of cities, carrying with them the weight of a past that no one wanted to hear about anymore. They were ghosts in invisible uniforms. Some obtained minor public positions: market inspectors, urban security guards, administrative assistants, humble but stable positions. And in a society that despised weakness, this stability was a triumph, because it allowed them to retain some dignity. Others simply lived from day to day. They cared for animals, cleaned streets, sold trinkets. They were constant but invisible presences, part of the human landscape of an empire that needed them, but no longer recognized them. And yet, they remained standing, despite the pain, despite the abandonment. Some continued with faith. They visited temples, asked favors from the gods, and searched for spiritual meaning. Others cursed the heavens. They felt betrayed by both men and gods. But all, without exception, shared a common wound: that of oblivion. Rome kept raising monuments. It kept campaigning. It kept expanding. But it rarely stopped to look back, to look at those who left everything behind and lost everything. Because an empire doesn't stop for the fallen. It just keeps moving forward. And yet, those forgotten lives were the ones that held up the pillars of history. They were the anonymous people who made Rome's eternity possible. And that's why their stories must be told. Because without them, there is no glory, only hollow marble. But there are still secrets to be unearthed. In 6 AD, Emperor Augustus attempted to bring order to the uncertain fate of veterans by creating the Aerarium Militare, a military fund financed by special taxes. His promise was clear: every soldier who served his time would receive a fair pension, a piece of land, and a place in the Rome he had so fiercely defended. It was a ray of hope, a quiet revolution within a system that had long forgotten. For a while, the idea worked. Under organized emperors like Vespasian, the fund was fed with discipline, and payments arrived, if not on time, at least with some regularity. Finally, the veterans had something to hold on to. They were no longer just expendable pawns. They were pillars of an organization that was beginning to view them as essential to the stability of the empire. But every system depends on those who administer it. Over time, the fund was diverted, plundered, or ignored by emperors like Nero, more interested in their luxuries than in the moral debt of the empire. What it had been created to sustain began to crumble from within. Corruption seeped into every coin. Promises became weightless paper. Thus, thousands of veterans died waiting for a pension that never arrived. They went to administrative offices, showed their scars, their discharge certificates, and received silence or ridicule in return. Some pleaded with senators, retired officers, and local governors. Others simply gave up, lacking the strength or faith to persist. The failure of the military fund wasn't just a logistical problem. It was a symbolic wound. It confirmed what many feared. Rome used, then forgot. What was once a sacred oath was now a broken contract. And when an empire breaks its word, it breaks something deeper than the economy. It breaks loyalty. Despite everything, there were regions where some veterans were welcomed by more just commanders, or by cities that understood their value as citizens. These were exceptions, yes, but they were enough to keep hope alive. Because even in the midst of abandonment, every soldier clung to the possibility that their sacrifice had not been in vain. But that hope would also begin to fade. One of the solutions Rome implemented to manage veteran integration was resettlement in military colonies. There, retired soldiers received land to farm, modest homes, and the respect of local communities. In return, they maintained a strategic function. They consolidated the Romanization of newly conquered territories. These colonies were, in theory, a prize, a new life away from the chaos of Rome, with space to plant crops, raise a family, and build a legacy. But in practice, they were often disguised frontiers, unstable zones, exposed to revolts, assaults, or reprisals from peoples not yet fully subdued. They weren't retreats, they were permanent trenches. The veterans accepted this fate because there was no better option. It was either that or wander aimlessly. Many became local leaders, judges, merchants, teachers. They carried with them a sense of duty, the iron discipline of the legions. In some regions, these colonies were transformed into true Roman cities, with theaters, forums, and aqueducts. But there were also the forgotten, those who didn't receive fertile land, but rather arid plots, those who didn't know how to farm because they'd never known any other trade than killing. Some sold their land to usurers. Others were tricked by corrupt officials who kept what was owed to them. Once again, Rome failed to keep its promise. Life in the colonies could be peaceful or desperate, depending on chance and the veterans' ability to adapt. Some managed to rebuild their lives, start families, and heal. Others didn't. Others fell into alcoholism, domestic violence, and the bitterness of knowing they had given everything. And still, it wasn't enough. The irony was brutal. The men who had expanded the empire's borders were now used as human walls, as meat shields against external threats. And they did it with resignation, with pride, or with rage. But they did it because being a soldier of Rome wasn't a choice. It was a curse that extended beyond the battlefield. And for many, not even death brought rest. The death of a general was accompanied by honors, processions, and statues. But the death of a wounded veteran, abandoned in a back street in some remote province, passed without rituals, without public tears, without epitaphs. Only silence bid him farewell. A silence that hurt more than any war wound. Many were buried in mass graves on the outskirts of cities, nameless, unmarked, and without history. Their bodies, already scarred by violence, were discarded as if they had never belonged to the empire. No trace remained of their campaigns, their achievements, their scars. Only oblivion. And yet, some managed to leave a mark. On humble tombstones, sometimes written by their own hands before their deaths, we read heart-rending phrases. I served Rome. I died alone. Other times, it was their children who wrote, Here lies my father, forgotten by gods and men. There is more truth in those broken stones than in all the speeches from the Senate. Archaeology has revealed inscriptions that speak of veterans who lived in misery or who died violently after years of neglect. Letters found in ancient camps show desperate pleas for the promised pension. Some wrote until they lost their sight. Others died waiting for a reply. And yet, Rome marched on. The imperial machine didn't stop for one man, or for 100. History moved forward, pushing those who were no longer useful underground. But every inch of that progress was soaked in blood. And that blood had a name, even if no one remembered it, because history isn't fair. Only the powerful decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. And for centuries, those soldiers remained in the shadows. Today, their bones rest beneath modern streets. Their rusty weapons sleep in museums, but their history still burns. And the cruelest part is yet to be told. For many veterans, returning home wasn't a celebration. It was a second loss. They had left the war behind, yes, but also camaraderie, structure, and identity. In civilian life, they were nobodies. A peasant looked at them with suspicion. An official treated them like beggars. They didn't fit in anywhere. Rome was an empire proud of its strength. It glorified conquest and exalted discipline, but it had no emotional space for fragility. To feel too much was suspect. To suffer out loud was shameful. Thus, thousands of men bore their pain in silence, knowing that to share it was to expose themselves to ridicule. Many lived on the fringes, not by choice, but because they didn't know how to return to the life they had left. Families changed. Children grew up without understanding the man who returned home with a blank stare and a rusty sword. He wasn't a father. He wasn't a husband. He was a stranger who had known hell. And yet, society continued to demand that they be strong, that they not break, that they be grateful to be alive. But being alive isn't the same as being at peace. For many, death would have been a respite. Because living with a broken soul is a slow, constant, invisible torture. The streets of Rome were filled with such specters. Men talking to themselves, reacting to the slightest sound, flinching at the shadow of a tunic. Not all of them were mad. They were just tired, exhausted from carrying a weight that can't be seen, but crushes like a shield. And yet, every day they got up. They walked. They tried to find meaning. They searched for work, love, faith, not for themselves, for their children, for their memory, for the oath they once swore, because deep down, they still wanted to believe that their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. And that desire is what keeps them alive. In official annals, these men barely appear. Their names are lost among numbers, among units, among parchment margins, but their voices remain, buried between the lines, in unfinished letters, in faceless statues, in the echoes of the cities they helped found, and that, today, Roman art celebrated heroes. But on the margins of those reliefs, if one looks closely, one sees tired, defeated figures, soldiers without glory. Perhaps a compassionate sculptor decided to include them. Perhaps it was an act of artistic resistance, of silent memory. But they are there, silent witnesses to an incomplete history. Some writers, like Tacitus and Suetonius, mention them briefly, almost with embarrassment, as if, by doing so, they broke the official narrative, as if acknowledging human suffering would taint Rome's greatness. But those mentions, however minimal, are seeds. They are traces, and it is our responsibility to rescue them. Every time a tomb is opened, every time a forgotten inscription is read, a part of that history is resurrected, because history doesn't belong only to the victors. It also belongs to those who paid the price. And in the case of Rome, the price was extremely high. Today, when we walk through museums or ruins, we see helmets, swords, coins, but we rarely see what matters: the suffering endured by those who wore them. That's why this story isn't just memory, it's justice. It's a way of saying, they weren't invisible, they weren't useless, They were the soul of the empire, and although Rome failed to embrace its scars, we can listen to them, understand them, honor them. Because only when we face the shadows of the past head-on can we learn something real from the present, and there's still more to be revealed. For many veterans, civilian life was a different kind of war. There were no shields or formations. There were no clear orders or visible enemies. Only the daily challenge of finding work, food, and respect. It was a deaf battlefield where the enemy was oblivion, indifference, and exclusion. Some tried to rebuild their lives from scratch. They took up modest trades, blacksmiths, bakers, transporters. They used what they learned on campaign to repair weapons, build structures, and train young men. They transformed military discipline into everyday efficiency. They weren't seeking glory. They just sought a viable life. Others, without any other options, turned to the temples, not to ask for revenge or favors, but to find solace. Many veterans found in religion what Rome had denied them: meaning, an inner respite. They worshipped Mars, Jupiter, and local tutelary gods. They sought signs, relief, redemption, but there was also darkness. Some, overcome by hopelessness, turned to more violent paths. They became bodyguards for corrupt politicians, debt collectors for loan sharks, brothel thugs. They didn't do it out of cruelty. They did it because survival has no morals when the stomach growls. The line between veteran and outlaw became blurred. In the eyes of the common citizen, it was easy to judge. But behind every ex-soldier turned criminal was a story of abandonment, a story that began on the battlefield and ended in a prison cell or in an unmarked ditch. Yet each of them carried the ghosts of their comrades on their backs. With every step, with every decision, they carried with them the echoes of those who died, of those who still suffered, of those who had no chance or voice. And that memory, even among shadows, made them human, because the heart of Rome wasn't in the marble. It was in them, in their daily struggle, in their attempt to keep walking with their heads held high, even when the world pushed them to the ground. And then the question arose, who really deserved to be called a hero? Wounds of the body heal, but those of the soul, those are inherited. Roman society, by ignoring its veterans, not only betrayed them, but also betrayed itself. Because a people who glorify war, but despise the broken warrior, build their identity on a rift. As the years passed, the families of these soldiers also suffered. Children raised by emotionally absent men, wives who didn't understand the perpetual silence, the sudden anger, the insomnia, the withdrawal. The war took hold in their homes. It changed the way they loved, spoke, and raised children. Some grandchildren of veterans grew up with stories told in half, fragmented accounts, broken by shame or pain. Your grandfather served in Germania, they said, but they kept quiet about what came next, because suffering becomes a secret when there is no language to express it. And yet, entire generations lived under the shadow of that violence. Because the scar of an empire is not only in its monuments, but in the voices that were silenced. And that silence, when it accumulates, becomes an inner noise, an open wound that spans centuries. Even today, studies of historical trauma look to Rome as an archetypal example, not because it was worse than other empires, but because its glory was as intense as its ability to ignore the pain that sustained it. The most structured civilization of antiquity was also one of the most blind to its internal wounds. But this blindness wasn't pure evil. It was a strategy of power. If suffering was acknowledged, the fragility of the system was also acknowledged. And Rome couldn't afford to appear fragile, not to its enemies, not to its own people. That's why the soldier's pain was a taboo disguised as virtue. However, the scars speak, and even if no one wants to listen, they're still there. They remind everyone that strength without compassion is a mask that sooner or later breaks. And the mask of Rome would also begin to crack. The centuries passed. Rome continued to expand, adapt, and endure. But within the heart of the empire, something was unraveling. It wasn't just politics or economics, it was humanity. The systematic neglect of its own soldiers began to have consequences that not even the emperors could ignore. In times of crisis, the legions began to fill with men with less motivation, less loyalty, and less faith in the system. Because stories of abandoned veterans spread like smoke in a dry field. No one wanted to give their lives for a promise that wouldn't be kept. Thus, internal revolts began to multiply, units refusing to fight, betrayals during key campaigns, commanders unable to maintain discipline because their men were fed up, not with the war, but with the contempt, with being forgotten, with being used as cannon fodder. The machinery that had conquered half the world was rusting from the inside. Because an army is only as strong as the treatment of its weakest soldier, and Rome, in its arrogance, forgot that steel also tires, that even the toughest legionary needs more than bread and the whip to keep fighting. Meanwhile, the empire's enemies watched and attacked and won. The borders became more difficult to defend, the military colonies more vulnerable, the pension system completely collapsed, the hospitals abandoned, the veterans furious or resigned. It wasn't just a military collapse, it was an ethical decomposition, an emotional collapse that preceded the political one. Because Rome didn't fall suddenly, it crumbled slowly, starting where no one was looking. Its wounded soldiers, its forgotten citizens, its invisible pillars. And so, the empire that had had it all began to lose the one thing it could not replace, its soul. But even in the ruin, some lights were still on. Not everyone resigned themselves. On the fringes of the empire, there were veterans who decided not to disappear. They organized communities, helped each other, and passed on their knowledge. They were teachers, mentors, and rural leaders. They turned pain into wisdom and scars into a compass. In Hispania, Gaul, and North Africa, there are records of small groups of former soldiers who created defense cooperatives. They kept roads safe, protected villages, and trained young people, not as legions, but as guardians of a legacy they refused to let die. Some even wrote fragmented memoirs, military diaries, fictional accounts that concealed uncomfortable truths. They did so because they knew that telling their story was the only way to avoid disappearing completely. Their pen was their last weapon, their testimony, their form of revenge. Others built temples, not to the gods, but to memory. Meeting places where former comrades gathered to remember, to mourn, to resist. Small sanctuaries made of humble stone, but charged with dignity. There, oblivion did not enter. There, war had a name. Official history doesn't mention them, but the ashes of their fires, the paths they tended, the fields they cultivated. Because resisting isn't always about shouting. Sometimes it's simply about carrying on, continuing to live when everything pushes toward the abyss, continuing to believe, even when the world has stopped believing. These men, broken but standing, are the true Rome. Not the one made of marble, nor the one made of speeches, the Rome that bled, the Rome that wept, the Rome that did not allow itself to be completely destroyed. And thanks to them, there's still something left to fight for. As the empire faded, embers remained. In every corner of the Roman world, a spark survived. Not that of power, nor that of luxury. It was that of memory. That of those who, despite being abandoned, continued to believe that their story deserved to be told, that their pain deserved to be heard. That flame burned in the voice of an elderly veteran telling his grandson what it was like to march into Germania. It burned in the gesture of a legless man teaching orphaned children to write. It burned in the letters that never arrived, in the murmured prayers, in the tattoos erased by time, and even today, it burns in the books that attempt to reconstruct history, in documentaries, in recovered sculptures, in restored tombs. Every attempt at memory is an act of justice, a small rebellion against silence, a gesture of humanity amid centuries of indifference. Because Rome wasn't just its emperors, it was also its forgotten ones, its wounded, its fallen, and as long as even one of them is remembered, the empire, in a sense, lives on, not in its power, but in its truth. And that truth compels us. It compels us to look beyond the marble, to listen to the muffled cries, to understand that behind every victory there is a price, and that the true duty of history is not to celebrate, but to understand. The flame hasn't gone out. It's here, in this story, in whoever hears it, in whoever honors it. And the closure of this journey is still pending. In the final decades of the empire, Rome was no longer the Rome of Augustus or Trajan. It had become a gigantic, weary body, governed by fragile bureaucracies and temporary emperors. The legions, once the pride of civilization, were a reflection of that exhaustion. Improvised recruits, embittered veterans, desertions that no longer scandalized. The image of the glorious legionary faded, in contrast to the increasingly common figure of the marginalized soldier. The eternal city, filled with temples and forums, harbored in its shadows a parallel legion, that of those who returned without receiving anything. A silent, invisible mass, whose stories were not told in marble or papyrus. These men no longer had a homeland. Some took refuge in the Eastern religions that were gaining strength on the fringes of the empire. Mithraism, Christianity, mystery cults. There they found solace, a narrative that did include suffering, a God who did look upon them with compassion. Others simply dissolved into the crowd. They became peons, laborers, shadows that went unnoticed. They lived in slums, shared precarious roofs, survived on the bare minimum. They didn't expect justice. They didn't expect redemption. They just wanted to breathe another day. And yet, that underground network of veterans created invisible bonds. They helped other fallen soldiers. They shared bread, stories, and warnings. It was a brotherhood without emblems, a legion that no longer obeyed orders, but still shared the weight of the same pain. They weren't revolutionaries. They didn't seek to overthrow the empire. But their very existence was a reminder that Rome wasn't perfect, that beneath its cloak of civilization lay broken bodies, and that if that voice wasn't heard, what was built wasn't a city, but a mask. And that mask would soon crack completely. Centuries passed. The empire fell. Europe changed. Cities rose from ruins. Languages evolved. Maps were redrawn. But beneath the layers of time, the history of the veterans remained, waiting to be unearthed. Not in books of glory, but in scattered fragments, inscriptions, bones, broken weapons. It was thanks to archaeology that some of these voices began to be heard again. In Britannia, tombstones were found of soldiers who died without ever receiving their promised land. In Germania, unsent letters were buried in chests alongside rusty medals. In Africa, surgical tools lay next to mutilated bones. Every discovery is a rescue. Every legible word, a belated redemption. Because it's not just about uncovering artifacts, but about reconstructing souls. About understanding who they were, what they felt, how they survived. About giving them back the place that was denied them while they were alive. Museums, universities, documentary filmmakers all began to form a new narrative, one that speaks not only of conquests and emperors, but of wounds, silences, and absences. One that includes the anonymous fallen, the wounded who died of fever in a forgotten camp. History, at last, opened up space for them, not with statues, but with questions. Not with marble, but with memory. Because remembering isn't just an academic act. It's an act of justice. It's telling them they were not in vain. Their pain left its mark. And so, from the dust, they began to speak, with the voice of one who waited centuries to be heard, with the firmness of one who is no longer afraid, with the dignity of one who suffered and still endured. And that voice, once released, cannot be silenced. Telling this story isn't a luxury. It's a responsibility. Because civilizations aren't defined only by their conquests, but by how they treat their wounded. Rome was great, yes, but it was also unjust. And acknowledging this isn't betraying its legacy, but rather understanding it fully. Every society, every nation, has its own forgotten soldiers, its own version of these veterans who gave everything and received little. Remembering them isn't about looking at the past with guilt, but rather looking at the present with awareness. Asking ourselves what we are doing today with those who fight, with those who protect, with those who return broken. The history of Rome serves as a mirror. It shows us what can happen when glory becomes an excuse for negligence, when heroism is exploited and then discarded, when sacrifice is demanded but not honored. This documentary doesn't aim to glorify war or condemn an entire empire. It aims to shed light on what was hidden, to humanize those who were used as disposable items, to give them a voice, even if it's too late, and hopefully to inspire us to never repeat such abandonment. Because pain shouldn't take centuries to be understood. Because scars shouldn't be a cause for shame, but rather respect. Because everyone who bears the consequences of war deserves to be embraced, not silenced. And if Rome, with all its power, couldn't do it, at least we can try. And that is already a victory. The legacy of Rome's veterans is not measured in battles won or statues erected. It is measured in the tenacity with which they survived, in their ability to carry on when all was lost, in their humanity, tested with every step they took on roads paved with indifference. Each of them represents the hidden face of the empire, the part not taught in schools, but also the most real part. Because there is no history without suffering, there is no greatness without cost. And behind every extended border, there was a bleeding body. That legacy lives on in us today, in our understanding of sacrifice, in our questions about justice and dignity, in our need to recognize those forgotten by power. They are the ones who teach us that civilization is not measured by its achievements, but by its compassion. Therefore, every restored tomb, every translated text, every recovered name is a flower planted in the garden of memory, an act of reparation, of connection, of belated love, a testimony that says, "We see you, we hear you, you are not alone." Because history isn't closed, it's rewritten every time someone decides to look beyond the surface. And when we do, we don't just rescue the past. We rescue a part of ourselves, the part that needs meaning, justice, truth. They, the forgotten, give us that. They teach us to see with different eyes, to listen with different hearts, to build a broader, more just, more human memory. And in that gesture, we also build a different future. On the battlefields, everything was noise, swords clashing, war cries, blood on the ground. But when the last spear fell, when the dust settled, the real war began. The one fought without clear enemies. The one that yields no medals or songs. The war of return. The war of existing after hell. This is the end of a journey and the beginning of an eternal debt. Because for every statue of an emperor, there should be 1,000 names of soldiers who gave their body and soul. For every celebrated victory, a recognition of the pain that made it possible. For every triumphant march, a minute of silence for those who never returned. Telling this story is giving these men what Rome didn't: visibility. Not to glorify them without nuance, but to restore their humanity, to look them in the eye, even if it's across time, and say, "We see you, we believe you, we honor you." There's no happy ending here, because the true ending never came for them. They kept fighting until their last breath, against hunger, shame, abandonment, and yet they endured, they lived, and in their silent struggle, they wove an eternal lesson, a lesson about dignity, about memory, about what it truly means to be strong, and about the importance of not letting silence cover everything, because even if the fight is over, history must not be silent. Surviving the Roman war wasn't a victory. It was the beginning of another struggle, longer, more painful, more silent. The soldiers who wielded the gladius for the empire didn't ask for statues or hymns. They asked to be remembered, to be recognized, to be seen, not as unblemished heroes, but as human beings who gave everything and yet were abandoned. This journey through the shadows of the empire is an act of belated justice. It's a way of giving back the voice to those who only knew silence, of honoring not glory, but suffering, of understanding that an empire is not defined by its conquests, but by how it treats those it can no longer use. And Rome, in its greatness, failed to take care of its own pillars. But we can listen. We can look back and say, "I'm sorry. Thank you. We haven't forgotten you." Because rescuing these stories isn't just a historical exercise, it's an act of empathy, a mirror that forces us to ask ourselves, who are we leaving behind today? If this story touched you, if any of these voices resonated within you, subscribe to the channel, not only to see more content, but to be part of a community that values memory, truth, and the humanity behind every historical event. Click the bell so you don't miss future episodes, where we'll continue giving a voice to those who were silenced. And comment below, what did this story leave you with? Do you know of others that deserve to be told? Sharing this video is also an act of resistance, because every new person who sees it is another flame in this torch of memory. Share it. Make it reach far and wide. Give these men what Rome denied them, a place in history. Thank you for coming this far. Thank you for listening with your heart. This channel isn't just about information. It's a space to feel, to reflect, to connect with the deepest part of humanity. Here, every story matters. Every scar counts. We'll see you again soon. Until then, don't stop looking back with fresh eyes, because in the past, there are still lives waiting to be understood.